Epstein's Comos, an attempt to sort of funnel some thinking about the origins of comedy back over to the current revelations as the systematic media is presenting them to us. Okay, so we have Epstein Isle high on the visibility of the media today, and it's presented as a kind of as it were core of the core as against the total periphery. It's presented as something taken in these sort of binary slogans which cropped up in the 60s or so. If we take it as the core of the victimizers as against the rest of the world, the victims, the core of the how else should we say this? There's some kind of juxtaposition between the thing that should be resisted. You know, you hear this slogan all the time, resist Trump. That was popular, at least during his first election. During his first term. Trump 45. And actually, even on the campus, although it's formally against the rules, there were a few instances of I suppose faculty that put the or staff that put the this rebellion, this rebel slogan in some windows. But then who's the one rebelling against? In the full sense of this binary, it must be the Epstein Islanders, because they're supposedly the core of the elite. So the word, this notion of the world cabal or something like that. And Alex Jones' rabbit at the mouth about the CIA was the role they played in all this. I want to see that in terms of the origins of comedy. So in Aristotle, there's this discussion in Book 4, the Poetics, and then we have this the bit of business, if you like, that's back behind the how's it called? In the Name of the Rose, right? Where the game of it is that there was supposed to be a lost book on comedy in Aristotle, which seems to have been the case. So there's a book that didn't come down to us, but there are things that he did say about comedy, one of which is the Ionescu-worthy line, we know much more about tragedy than we do about comedy because comedy wasn't taken seriously. So there's something Freudian, if you like. Maybe it's arbitrary that Freud, through this very particular path, came to put so much weight on humor. Of course, Freud doesn't actually say humor is the royal road to the unconscious, as he says the dream is. If I remember correctly. But what is comedy? What is comedy? So the first part of the word komos means revel, or at least that's how it's being interpreted or transmitted to us. And okay, so one could suppose there's supposedly revels of some kind going on in the Epstein Island. That's what's indicated, right? And they're revels of a kind that must remain somehow, that are immoral, that are treated as immoral. And the second part of the word, odios or aodia, it's something to do with odes or rhapsodes, or as a musical term, songs. So revelers' songs. How did it come to be that these revelers with their reveler songs became comedy? One possible meaning is in the sort of outskirts of the policies. There's these things called come. I think this is what Aristotle says, and they were especially in Megaria, or Aristotle, one of the determinative factors in Aristotle's metaphysics comes from his rejection of the Megarian claim about dunamis, or potential, that we can never really talk about dunamis or potential in a serious way, because we never really know until something happens, in the sense of, like, somebody is a trained, proficient as a instructor at the Naval War School, let's say, and they come out with the article about Homer or something like that, because that's still taught there. But we never know if at the exact moment they come to write that article, maybe they'll have an aneurysm, maybe for some reason they won't be able to handle the subject anymore. I mean, like Fiona Apple said in some interview, like, oh, there's a couple songs I'll never perform again, and it's just because I wouldn't know how to perform them anymore, whatever that means. Like, partially because she doesn't want to for emotional reasons, partially because maybe she doesn't know how she was getting away with something originally that now she sees as something that only could be done per impossibile. And yeah, you have the notion of drunken revelers going through these outskirts, which would be the demes, if Aristotle says, if it were of Athenian origin, but actually, yeah, this Commedia is of Megarian origin. It's a foreign dialect also, besides from being a foreign region. And they use different words than we would for this type of thing. So that's one version, is the drunken revelers in the sort of urban outskirts. But then we have this heavy sort of connection to Dionysus. I know people say Dionysius, but we should try to distinguish the shorter name of the god from the longer name of the tyrant, and many others. And so, yeah, there's something Nietzschean, which was the way I played that game on the origin of comedy. Why didn't Nietzsche write on the origin of comedy? It would have made more sense, right? Because the comedy is about reveling, and reveling is almost rausch. So maybe he was already thinking that in a way. Komos, the first part of the word comedy could be interpreted as rausch in a way. The drunken reveille winding its way through the urban outskirts in nonsense songs, in double entendre of rape fantasies and other obscenities. And this, which is like the so-called, how is it called, the people that founded in New Orleans, the carnival, talked about the mystical mystical bond of the Comos or something like that. They had some name they called themselves that had some references to some literature. Maybe to Shakespeare, and I think to another major author, but yeah, those who founded the carnival were thinking directly of the Saturnalia of Lent in the Catholic tradition, and then apparently also, therefore, of these original Comosians, or however they should be called, these original comedians. These songs involved both, and it's related also to the word encomium, which obviously it's a praise, but which could also be sort of celebration of victory, especially. But celebration of victory can be Saturnalian, it can be carnivalesque. But then there's this question that I think is interesting to bring in, is how is it that if there's a super moralized situation where more and more anything carnivalesque is suppressed, and then you get a George Orwell type situation morally, and then these this Captain Bligh element and so on, something these forces present themselves as a goal for success. So it's like then success appears as reaching the level of power where one can successfully make a private Saturnalia. I mean, it's a complicated notion because it's like we don't really know what the Comos is. In some cases, you have things that look like they're public, like Carnival. Most people wouldn't want, Carnival going through their private homes for the most part. But to the extent that what happens outside in Carnival then has a mirror in the private life, then there's a question of, how much something primitive in these movings around of morality then lead to this inverted structure of this, the victims or the general population as against the victimizers, or the ones that are supposed to be resisted, as a sort of structure that reminds of one zone having the comedy, and then the other zone always not being allowed the holiday of the freedom from the ethical structures. So there's something in the origin of comedy itself that speaks to our morality, and I think so. There's sort of a question of layerings, and when comedy is accepted officially by the archon or magistrate in Athens, this is about the 20 years before Socrates was born. So that's also sort of interesting. There's a sort of preparation for the life of somebody like Socrates in the specific narrative interpretation of comedy. So notice there's one, we were talking about drunken revelers in the urban areas, but now we're talking about comedy as it became an official feature of Athenian life about 20 years before Socrates was born. So there's something in there I think is not totally thought through in respect to that's a I think that gives a different sort of basic palette or basic instrumentum for working with the moral problems out of sort of a Greek view, doesn't it though? Because we have all the time whatever our own sort of compass is, and then we sort of translate that in terms of Democrat, Republican, and other ideological tags. Libertarian, for instance, or anarchist. But if we see the place we're in the lens of the origin of comedy, then everything hangs together in a different way, right? Everything has a moral nature, ethical nature, which is different and evaluated differently than the current most powerful sort of systematic internet media leading up to still the Supreme Court. What happens when the Supreme Court doesn't really matter anymore? That's very interesting. Because you could have said, like Leo Strauss would say, look at the Supreme Court, then you see they're not really paying attention to the Bible or the Ten Commandments or something like that. They're paying attention to the social science profession. That's who they cite. That's how they understand what they're doing. He doesn't mention that, also they're looking at the law schools. I think later on the law schools sort of took over what was happening in the social sciences and in other fields, and then used that partially as a basis. Richard Dworkin or somebody who's sophisticated brings in all the considerations they usually would say, it's happening in the philosophy department, but I think it's also really the whole social sciences and other fields have to come in quite a bit into the law. But if the Supreme Court can no longer be cited in this way to say, look, the highest court of the land no longer pays attention to the biblical sources, they pay attention to the academic sources, look at what a big difference that is. But what if there is no highest court of the law? Then where does this discussion would then sort of cease to be one of drama, or dreo is the word behind drama, which means to do, behind doing, and it would only be talking, right? It would only be linguistic. So the Supreme Court could go under. I think it would be better if it does, and I think then Vance should be somehow ushered in. I don't. I would just say Trump could give Trump some special status so that he could be assured he's not going to be prosecuted or something, and then have him step down in favor of Vance. That's what I think. And then the Supreme Court should be sort of squashed. The parties should be dissolved, as it were, abrogated. Because the party system has led to the current chaos. It's led to this current thing that we have a law that's on the books that so many people don't want to enforce, and then some other people try to enforce it, which all this immigrant stuff is happening about. And quite a bit of that is sort of like natural, ununderstandable features of whatever is currently happening in the United States, to use this sort of Epstein way of thinking there's something that's making that happen according to the current arrangements, and it could be reset, but it would require to actually shut down unplug the current legal order.